The day I started at Blackwood National Park, I sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes just staring at the entrance sign. Not from nerves. I was savoring it. 26 years old with my ranger badge finally pinned to my chest. I'd dreamed about this since I was a kid who couldn't stay indoors. "You're officially late for your first day," I told myself, starting the engine again. The main station looked exactly like the photos on the National Park Service website. A sturdy wooden building with a sloped roof nestled among towering pines. Chief Ranger Davis met me at the front desk with a firm handshake and minimal small talk. "Anderson? Good. Your uniform fits?" He looked me up and down with the scrutiny of someone who'd been doing this job since before I was born. "Yes, sir." "You'll be shadowing Ranger Wilson for the first month. Listen more than you talk." He handed me a thick binder. "Park protocols. Memorize them." I nodded, trying not to smile too wide. Even his gruffness couldn't dampen my excitement. Those first few months passed in a blur of trail maps, wildlife catalogs, and visitor interactions. I spent my off hours hiking every path in my assigned sector, sometimes twice. I learned which creeks ran fastest after rainfall, which meadows bloomed earliest in spring, where the elk preferred to graze at dusk. I kept a notebook filled with observations most rangers wouldn't bother recording. The specific chirp of a western tanager, the texture of different mosses, how certain slopes felt under my boots. By the end of my first year, I could navigate most of the northern section blindfolded. That's not an exaggeration. Wilson actually tested me once, leading me half a mile with my eyes covered, then asking me to identify our location. I got it right within 20 yards. "Not bad, Anderson," she said, removing the bandana from my eyes. Most rookies would have been screaming for their GPS by now. I brushed dirt off my pants. "The ground tells you everything you need to know. That depression we crossed about 100 yards back, that's the seasonal creek bed next to Maple Ridge Trail." "Show off," she said, but I caught the smile she tried to hide. It was during that first autumn when I noticed something odd. A section of ferns near Aspen Grove, completely withered in a perfect circle, like someone had poured herbicide in an exact pattern. But there was no chemical smell, no signs of human interference. "Probably just a fungus," Wilson suggested when I mentioned it. "Nature does weird shit sometimes." She was right. I knew that. But something about that circle stuck with me. 2 weeks later, it was gone. New growth had erased any trace, like the ground had never been disturbed. Other things started catching my attention. A day when all the birds went silent at once. A coyote pack that abruptly changed their denning location mid-season. Small things most people wouldn't notice. Most rangers wouldn't either. Around the campfire during training week, senior rangers would sometimes share stories, the ones they claimed weren't for the tourists' ears. "You ever been up to Blackwater Ridge at dusk?" Ranger Mitchell asked one night, his face ghostly in the firelight. Something about that place. Hikers report feeling watched. Eyes in the trees, they say. The others nodded knowingly. "That's just wilderness psychology," I said, poking at the fire with a stick. "People get spooked when they're away from streetlights and cell service." Mitchell shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe there are things in these woods older than the Park Service." I laughed it off. Ghost stories were part of ranger culture, ways to entertain ourselves during long seasons in the backcountry. Besides, after a full year working at Blackwood, I'd seen nothing that science couldn't explain. My second and third years passed without major incident. I earned my own patrol routes, led search and rescue training, gave nature talks that visitors actually stayed awake for. I became known as the ranger who could identify any plant or animal track in the park. Davis even nodded at me occasionally, which counted as high praise. Then came my fourth year. The spring thaw revealed a backpack belonging to a hiker reported missing the previous fall. June brought a family frantically reporting their teenage son had wandered off from their campsite overnight. By August, we'd logged 6 missing persons, more than the previous 3 years combined. I was there when we found the third missing hiker, or rather, what was left of him. The official report cited animal predation, probably bear, but the pattern of damage didn't match any bear attack I'd ever studied. I kept that observation to myself after seeing Davis's reaction to another ranger suggesting the same thing. "We deal in facts, not speculation," Davis said during an all-staff meeting after the fourth disappearance. "These are unfortunate but normal wilderness incidents. Bear populations are up this year, and hikers are getting careless with food storage." He looked directly at me when he added, "I don't want to hear anyone spreading alternatives that might panic visitors." New safety protocols arrived via memo the following week: mandatory partner patrols, enhanced communication check-ins, expanded restricted areas around cave systems and certain remote trails. The email didn't mention the disappearances, just cited revised best practices. Wilson caught me reading the memo in the break room. "You buying the bear theory?" she asked, keeping her voice low despite the empty room. I hesitated. "Not entirely. You?" "I've been here 12 years. Never seen a cluster like this." She poured coffee into her mug, the one with the faded park logo. "Davis asked me to transfer some old incident reports to digital. Found some interesting patterns going back decades." "What kind of patterns?" She glanced toward the door. 7-year cycles, increased missing persons, unusual animal behavior, then nothing for years. I thought back to the withered fern circle from 3 years earlier. "You think there's something else happening?" "I think—" She stopped as footsteps approached. When Davis entered, she smoothly changed topics. "So that's how you reset the emergency radio if it malfunctions." I played along. "Got it. Thanks for the tip." Despite the new buddy system requirement, I still took solo hikes occasionally, not on duty. That would mean direct insubordination, but on my days off, wearing civilian clothes with my ranger badge tucked in my pocket. I told myself it was to maintain my familiarity with the terrain. The truth was simpler. I'd always preferred solitude in nature. One October morning, I hiked out to Ridgeline Point, about 7 miles from the nearest road. The maple leaves had turned brilliant red, contrasting against the evergreens. I stopped to photograph a particularly vivid display when I noticed something unusual: a set of tracks that didn't match any wildlife typically found in the area. They resembled bear prints in size, but the toe pattern was wrong. 5 forward-facing digits, almost hand-like. I took multiple pictures and measurements, thinking they might belong to an injured animal, or perhaps someone playing a prank. The tracks led toward Ridgeline Cave, a limestone formation we'd closed to the public years before I arrived, supposedly due to unstable internal structures. I followed the tracks to the cave entrance but stopped at the heavy metal security gate blocking access. Strange sounds came from inside, scratching mixed with something I couldn't identify. Probably raccoons or maybe a fox that had found another way in. I made a mental note to file a maintenance request about possible wildlife accessing the restricted cave, then headed back. That night, I dreamed of dark tunnels and something moving just beyond my flashlight beam. Looking back now, I recognize that moment as the beginning. The first thread pulled in a sweater that would completely unravel. If I'd known what waited inside Ridgeline Cave, maybe I would have requested a transfer. Found another park where rangers only worried about littering tourists and occasional wildfires. But I didn't know. None of us did. We were just people doing our jobs in a wilderness that suddenly seemed less familiar than we thought. And whatever had always been there in the woods was starting to notice us too. I couldn't just walk away. Those tracks didn't match anything I'd documented in 4 years of ranger work. And that sound, that wasn't normal wildlife behavior. My maintenance request would sit in the system for days before anyone checked it. By then, whatever made those prints might be long gone. I glanced at the heavy metal security gate blocking the cave entrance. The padlock seemed intact, but the gate itself had a gap at the bottom where smaller animals could potentially squeeze through. Something in there was making those sounds, scratching mixed with what I could only describe as wet clicking. If it was an injured animal, I couldn't just leave it suffering. Protocol dictated I should radio in my position, request backup, and wait. I reached for my radio, then hesitated. Davis would immediately order me away from the restricted area, especially since I was off duty and technically just a civilian hiker today. Just a quick look, I muttered to myself, pulling out my flashlight. 5 minutes. I examined the gate more carefully. The padlock secured the door, but the hinges on the left side had rusted considerably. With enough pressure, the gate shifted about 8 inches, enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. I sucked in my stomach and pushed through the gap, my jacket catching briefly on the rough metal. The temperature dropped immediately once I entered, at least 15 degrees cooler than outside. My breath formed small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The main tunnel sloped downward, its limestone walls slick with moisture. Water dripped somewhere further in, each drop echoing through the cavern. I swept my light across the floor, finding the same unusual tracks continuing inside. They looked fresher here, the edges more defined in the soft cave soil. The sounds grew clearer now, a rhythmic scratching punctuated by that wet clicking noise like someone rapidly tapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth, but amplified. It came from deeper in the cave, past where the main tunnel curved out of sight. I should have turned back. Everything about this screamed warning. But 4 years of curiosity about Blackwood's oddities pushed me forward, one cautious step at a time. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it as my voice bounced off the walls, distorting into something unrecognizable. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sounds had been. I moved forward, keeping my light aimed at the ground to avoid tripping. The main tunnel curved to the right, opening into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam seemed to dim, swallowed by the vastness of the space ahead. The air felt different here, denser, almost sticky in my lungs. The scratching resumed but changed its pattern. It seemed more deliberate now, like whatever made it had noticed my presence and adjusted accordingly. "It's just an animal," I whispered to myself, "probably trapped or injured." I took another step into the chamber, sweeping my light methodically from left to right. The beam caught limestone formations, water carved over centuries into twisted columns and rippling curtains. Natural. Normal. But then I noticed markings on some of the walls, not graffiti from trespassers, but deep grooves in sets of 5, as if something with massive claws had been sharpening them against the stone. The clicking grew louder, coming from the far corner where the chamber narrowed into another tunnel. I aimed my light there and froze. Something massive moved in the darkness. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a bear. The general shape and size matched a large black bear. But as it moved, I realized this was wrong. Its proportions were distorted. The neck stretched impossibly long, almost serpentine, supporting a head that seemed too small for its body. And its eyes. They caught my flashlight beam and reflected back a sickly green, like toxic pools in the darkness. I stood paralyzed, my training temporarily forgotten. The creature's head swiveled toward me with jerky, unnatural movements. It made that clicking sound again, but I could now see it wasn't coming from its mouth. It seemed to emanate from somewhere in its throat, which bulged and contracted. For 3 horrifying seconds, we stared at each other. Then it moved. The charge happened faster than seemed possible for something that size. One moment it was across the chamber, the next it was halfway to me, moving in a loping gait that didn't match any animal I'd ever studied. Its limbs bent at odd angles, too many joints folding and unfolding as it closed the distance. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran. The tunnel seemed narrower now, the walls closing in as I sprinted back toward daylight. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating disorienting shadows. Behind me, I heard the creature's bulk scraping against the stone walls. that clicking sound now interspersed with a high-pitched wail that made my skin crawl. I fumbled for my service weapon before remembering I was off duty. My civilian holster still held my service Glock, but I couldn't stop to draw it. The sound of claws scrabbling on stone told me the thing was gaining. The tunnel curved and I nearly crashed into the wall. My shoulder slammed hard against limestone, sending a jolt of pain down my arm. The flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling away and leaving me in near total darkness. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I oriented myself by running my hand along the wall, moving as fast as I dared. A faint glow ahead signaled the entrance, maybe 50 yards away. The creature's breathing sounded right behind me now, ragged and wet, nothing like a normal bear. Something brushed against my back, a sensation like rough leather dragging across my jacket. I put on a final burst of speed as the cave entrance grew brighter. Daylight had never looked so beautiful. I threw myself through the gap in the gate, spinning around immediately to slam it shut as something large crashed against the other side. A massive clawed appendage shot through the bars, not a paw, but something with opposable digits ending in curved talons. It grasped blindly for me as I stumbled backward. My gun, my Glock, slipped from its holster, clattering to the ground just beyond the gate's reach. I couldn't retrieve it. Not with those claws searching for purchase. The creature wailed from inside, a sound that started like an animal in pain, but morphed into something almost like speech, distorted syllables that made no sense but seemed shaped for communication. I didn't wait to analyze it. I ran. Through the woods, over fallen logs, splashing across a small creek. I didn't slow down until my truck came into view in the small dirt parking area near the trailhead. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked all doors and stared back at the forest edge, half expecting to see that thing emerge from the trees. Nothing followed. Just the normal sounds of birds and wind returned, as if the forest itself was pretending nothing had happened. I drove back to the ranger station with the windows up and heat blasting, though it did nothing for the chill that had settled in my core. I needed to report what I'd seen, to tell Davis or Wilson. But what exactly had I seen? A deformed bear? Some undocumented species? The rational part of my brain struggled to categorize it, while another part simply wanted to forget. That night, in my small cabin at the edge of ranger housing, I sat with all the lights on, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those green reflections staring back at me. The memory of that stretched neck and the way it moved, all wrong, like something wearing a bear's skin without understanding how a bear should behave, kept jerking me back to wakefulness. I'd lost my gun. I'd have to explain that. And I'd have to decide how much of the truth to tell about what I'd encountered in Ridgeline Cave. The next morning, I walked into the ranger station with a rehearsed story. I'd practiced it all night between failed attempts at sleep, each time waking up seeing those toxic green eyes staring back at me in the darkness of my cabin. Davis looked up from his computer as I knocked on his open office door. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, a stack of incident reports piled to his right. "Anderson, come in." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The small office smelled like coffee and old paperwork. "Sir, I need to report an incident from yesterday." My voice sounded steadier than I expected. I was hiking near Ridgeline Point during my off hours, and I lost my service weapon. Davis removed his glasses, folding them carefully. "You lost your Glock? Where exactly?" "Near Ridgeline Cave, sir." I swallowed hard. I encountered what I initially thought was a bear. His expression hardened. "The cave area has been restricted for years." "Yes, sir. I heard unusual sounds coming from inside, scratching, clicking. I was concerned it might be an injured animal." I paused, deciding how much to tell him. The gate had a gap at the bottom. I was able to slip through. Davis leaned back in his chair. "So you trespassed into a restricted area while off duty?" "Yes, sir." I shifted my weight. Inside, I found tracks that didn't match standard wildlife patterns. The toe configuration was wrong, 5 forward-facing digits, almost hand-like. Bear tracks can appear distorted in cave soil, moisture, uneven surfaces. His tone remained flat. With respect, sir, I know bear tracks. These were something else. I took a breath. And what I saw in there, it wasn't a bear. Not a normal one, anyway. What exactly are you suggesting you saw, Anderson? Davis's eyes narrowed. It was bear-sized, but its proportions were wrong. The neck was too long, the head too small. Its movements were... I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. Unnatural. And its eyes reflected green in my flashlight. Davis sighed heavily. Sounds like a disoriented bear to me, possibly malnourished, explaining the unusual proportions. Cave lighting plays tricks. Sir, it charged me. I dropped my weapon while running, but the way it moved... Anderson. Davis cut me off sharply. 20 years here. Never seen anything science can't explain. You know what we deal in? Verifiable facts. Not impressions or feelings. He tapped his pen against the desk. Especially in official reports. I nodded, feeling my credibility slipping away with each word. I'd like permission to retrieve my weapon. Denied. Davis didn't hesitate. That area has new structural concerns. Recent geology surveys indicate possible instability. We'll be expanding the restricted zone next week. But my gun... We'll requisition you a replacement. He picked up a form and began filling it out. I'd advise you to stick to authorized areas in the future, especially when off duty. You're lucky you only lost a gun, and not your life to a disoriented bear. I knew further argument was pointless. Davis had already settled on his explanation, one that fit neatly into the world as he understood it. I nodded and left his office, the image of that creature's impossible movements replaying in my head. The nightmare started that same night. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of green eyes following me through dark tunnels so vivid I had to check all my closets before I could calm down. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd sit on my porch until dawn, coffee in hand, watching the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. After a week of this, I requested a schedule change. When Wilson asked why, I gave her some line about wanting more visitor interaction. The truth, that I couldn't stand patrolling the northern sector anymore, felt too much like admitting weakness. You're on the Pinewood Loop now, Wilson told me, sliding the new rotation schedule across the break room table. Busy area, lots of families. Perfect, I said, relief washing over me. Pinewood was the opposite direction from Ridgeline, surrounded by people. Safe. Wilson studied me for a moment too long. You seem different lately. Just tired, I answered too quickly. This have anything to do with that bear report from Ridgeline? She kept her voice casual, but her eyes were sharp. I stared at my coffee. Just ready for a change. She nodded, not pushing further, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Night shifts became my personal hell. Every snapping branch made me flinch. Every shadow moved in my peripheral vision. The other rangers noticed. Comments started as jokes. Jumpy today, Anderson? But grew into concerned glances and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. 3 weeks after the incident, Davis called me into his office again. Park administration has some concerns, he said without preamble. Your behavior has been erratic. Requisition for extra flashlights, requesting only daylight shifts, jumping at noises during briefings. I kept my face neutral. I'm fine, sir. Nevertheless, they're mandating a psychological evaluation before you continue field work. He slid a card across his desk. Dr. Simmons, tomorrow at 9. Tell me about the incident at Ridgeline Cave, Dr. Simmons said, her voice professional but kind. Her office smelled like vanilla and old books, walls lined with degrees and nature photographs. I gave her the sanitized version, the one Davis preferred. Restricted area, possible bear, dropped my weapon while retreating. And this has affected your sleep? She made a note on her pad. Wouldn't you be startled if a bear charged you in a dark cave? She smiled slightly. Yes, I would. But most rangers I've worked with process such encounters differently. They don't request immediate reassignment or avoid entire sectors of the park. I shifted in the too-soft chair. Look, I know what this evaluation is for. You need to clear me for duty. What I need is to understand what's really bothering you, Mark. She set her notepad down. Off the record. I studied her face, looking for judgment and finding none. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The impossible creature, the way it moved, those eyes that haunted my dreams. But I'd seen how Davis reacted. I knew how it sounded. I got spooked in the dark, I finally said. Imagination ran wild. Been working too many hours, that's all. Dr. Simmons didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. Well, that's something we can work with. I'm clearing you for duty, but I'd like to see you weekly for a while, to help with the sleep issues. I agreed, knowing this was the price of keeping my job. She wrote the clearance, and I was back on rotation the next day. I'd passed the evaluation by making myself small, by shrinking my experience down to something that fit into normal parameters. But normal didn't exist for me anymore. The library in town was small but had an impressive local history section. I started spending my days off there, digging through old newspapers and journals. I told myself I was being thorough, researching regional wildlife anomalies. The truth was more desperate. I needed to know if anyone else had seen what I saw. You're the ranger, right? The elderly librarian asked after my fourth visit. Looking for anything specific? Local legends, I admitted. Unusual animal sightings, maybe strange encounters in the woods. Older records if you have them. She smiled knowingly. I have just the thing. She disappeared into the back room, returning with a box of leather-bound journals. Original settler accounts from the 1880s. Not cataloged in our system yet. Most people find them boring, but... Thank you, I said, already reaching for them. Most entries detailed mundane pioneer life, crop yields, weather, illness. But scattered throughout were passages that made my blood run cold. A trapper in 1883 described losing his hunting dog near a cave system. Reappeared 3 days later but wasn't right, wouldn't eat, just sat staring, eyes all wrong. Had to put her down when she tried to bite my boy. A settler in 1887 wrote about his child's claim of meeting himself in the woods. Tommy says he saw another Tommy watching him from the trees. Said the other boy looked just like him but didn't talk right. Just repeated whatever Tommy said. The most detailed account came from a missionary in 1891 who documented local Native American warnings about forest mimics that learned by watching, creatures that wore faces not their own. I copied pages until my hand cramped, building a file that felt both ridiculous and vital. I never shared these findings with anyone at the station. They'd already thought I was unstable after the cave incident. This would only confirm their suspicions. Months passed. Winter turned to spring. My nightmares became less frequent, though never disappeared entirely. I settled into my new routine of Pinewood patrol, psychological sessions, where I said only what was needed to be cleared, and private research. The cave incident gradually faded from station gossip, replaced by routine park emergencies and visitor drama. By summer, I could almost convince myself it had been a bear, a deformed, sick bear that my frightened mind had transformed into something more sinister. Almost. Then came that Tuesday in June, 6 months after Ridgeline Cave. I was marking a new trail junction near Oak Meadow when movement caught my eye. 20 yards away, partially hidden by underbrush, stood a small figure. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stood perfectly still in the clearing. Too still. He wore a blue button-up shirt and khaki shorts that looked freshly pressed, despite being 4 miles from any campsite in an area thick with mud from yesterday's rain. I approached slowly, hand instinctively moving to my holster. "Hey there, you okay?" The boy turned his head with mechanical precision, his posture unnaturally rigid. His eyes met mine without blinking. "I'm Eric," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I'm hiking with my family." Every instinct in my body screamed danger. His posture remained frozen, like someone had propped up a mannequin among the pines. Even as a breeze rustled through the underbrush around us, his blue button-up shirt and pressed khaki shorts stayed perfectly still. Not a wrinkle formed, not a hair moved. "Hey, Eric," I said, keeping my tone casual despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "Where is your family right now?" Eric's head rotated to maintain eye contact as I stepped sideways. The movement wasn't fluid, it was precise, mechanical, like watching the second hand of a clock tick. "Where's your family right now?" he repeated, using my exact intonation. I moved closer, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of adults. The nearest trail junction was 2 miles back, and this particular section of Oak Meadow rarely saw visitors due to its distance from parking areas. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. His expression never changed. "How long have you been out here?" The kid hadn't blinked once since I'd spotted him, his eyes fixed on me with unwavering attention, like a predator tracking prey. And there was something else about those eyes. They seemed older than the body they belonged to. "Are you lost?" I tried again. "Are you lost?" he parroted back. I pulled my canteen from my belt. "Are you thirsty? Want some water?" I extended the bottle toward him. Eric looked at it without moving, not even raising his arms to accept it. "Want some water?" he repeated. When I set the canteen on the ground between us, he didn't reach for it, didn't even acknowledge it was there. The muddy forest floor had soaked everything within miles after yesterday's downpour. Pine needles stuck to my boots, and my pants were splattered with dirt halfway up my calves. Yet Eric's shoes, small brown loafers that looked like something from an old photograph, remained spotless. Not a speck of mud, not a single wet patch. I took a step back and unclipped my radio. "Dispatch, this is Anderson." The radio crackled. "Go ahead, Anderson." "I'm at Oak Meadow Junction, grid marker 7. I've encountered a minor approximately 10 years old separated from his family, requesting assistance." "Copy that. Wilson is already in Sector 6. I'll redirect her to your location. ETA 15 minutes. 10-4, I responded, eyes never leaving the boy. Eric's head tilted slightly. 10-4, he repeated, his mouth forming the words with such precision it almost looked rehearsed. I clipped the radio back to my belt. "Let's wait here for Ranger Wilson, okay? She'll help us find your family." "Let's wait here for Ranger Wilson, okay? She'll help us find your family," he echoed, perfectly matching my rhythm and tone. I tried another approach. "What are your parents' names?" "What are your parents' names?" "Where were you camping?" "Where were you camping?" Each answer came immediately without any processing time. There was no thought behind his responses, just perfect mimicry. I sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet away, keeping him in full view. "So, Eric, do you like hiking?" His eyes followed me down. "So, Eric, do you like hiking? Have you been to Blackwood Park before? Have you been to Blackwood Park before?" This continued for nearly 15 minutes, me asking questions, him repeating them verbatim. Throughout our one-sided conversation, he never moved from his original spot, never sat, never leaned against a tree, never showed any signs of fatigue or boredom that you'd expect from a child. I noticed another oddity. Despite standing in dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, Eric cast almost no shadow. The light seemed to bend around him in ways that made no physical sense. The crackle of a radio announced Wilson's approach before I saw her emerge from the trail to the west. Her gaze immediately found the boy, and I watched her expression change from professional concern to subtle unease. "Hey," she greeted me, keeping her voice low as she approached. "This our lost kid?" I nodded, standing up. Says his name is Eric. No last name. Won't or can't tell me where his family is. Just repeats everything I say. Wilson studied him for a moment. Hey there, Eric. I'm Ranger Wilson. We're going to help you find your family, okay? I'm Ranger Wilson. We're going to help you find your family, okay? Eric repeated. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. She turned to me, keeping her voice low. How long has he been doing that? Since I found him. He doesn't answer questions, doesn't accept water, doesn't seem distressed at all. I glanced back at Eric, and his clothes. Look how clean they are. After yesterday's rain, that's impossible. Wilson nodded slowly. I've got protocol cards in my pack for handling minors. Let me grab them. She moved a few steps away and began digging through her backpack. I turned back toward Eric, but the clearing was empty. Wilson, I called sharply. He's gone. We both spun around, scanning the dense trees surrounding us. Nothing moved except pine boughs in the breeze. That's impossible, Wilson muttered. I didn't look away for more than 3 seconds. We split up, circling the clearing in opposite directions. No footprints led away from where Eric had stood. No broken branches. No sound of someone running through underbrush. Anderson, over here, Wilson called. She stood at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something partially hidden by ferns. A small backpack, faded blue canvas with leather straps. It hadn't been there minutes earlier. I pulled on latex gloves before carefully picking it up. The material felt strangely old, the canvas stiff and worn in a way modern materials don't age. When I opened the main compartment, I found neatly folded children's clothing. A small wool sweater, corduroy pants, and a cap. All in styles I hadn't seen outside of history books. These look vintage, Wilson said, peering over my shoulder. Like 1950s era. At the bottom of the bag lay a small notebook bound in cracked leather. I carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with symbols that resembled writing but matched no alphabet I recognized. The markings seemed to change as I looked at them, reorganizing themselves when I turned the pages. What the hell is going on? Wilson whispered. I closed the notebook, suddenly not wanting to examine it any further. We need to expand the search, get additional rangers out here. Within an hour, 3 search teams combed the area while Wilson transported the backpack to the station for documentation. We covered a 5-mile radius, checking every trail, ravine, and potential hiding place. No sign of Eric. No evidence anyone had passed through the forest except us. When I returned to the station that evening, Chief Davis was waiting, the backpack sealed in an evidence bag on his desk. No visitor passes issued to any family with a boy matching that description, he said without preamble. No vehicles in any lot registered to an owner with a son named Eric. No camping reservations under similar names. Did you check missing persons? I asked. Davis nodded. Nothing recent that matches, but the clothing in this bag. He tapped the evidence bag. Textile expert from the university says it's authentic 1950s manufacturing. Not reproduction. And the notebook? Being analyzed. Initial assessment is that the symbols don't correspond to any known language. Davis fixed me with a hard stare. What exactly did you see out there, Anderson? I thought about those unblinking eyes, the perfectly clean clothes, the way he disappeared in seconds when our attention wavered. A boy who wasn't acting like a boy, I said finally. Something was wrong with him. The way he moved, spoke. It wasn't natural. Davis was silent for a long moment. The backpack will go into evidence. I've sealed this incident under restricted access. Sir, with respect, if there's a child in the park, no child disappearances have been reported. Davis cut me off. No evidence suggests this. Eric is in any danger. For now, we document and monitor. But as I walked to my cabin that night, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. The fear wasn't that we hadn't found Eric. The fear was that we might find him again, or whatever was wearing his shape. I spent that night checking and rechecking my locks, convincing myself the tapping at my window was just pine branches in the wind. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw Eric's unblinking stare and wondered what had been looking out at me from behind them. 3 weeks after the Eric incident, I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night. Every time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake from dreams of blank stares and perfect stillness. I'd requested a transfer to Pinewood Sector, telling myself it was because I needed more visitor contact and fewer remote patrols. The radio call came during my morning coffee. "Anderson, we've got a code Adam at Pinewood Campsite, Site 42. 7-year-old female last seen approximately 90 minutes ago." I set my mug down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the table. "Copy that. En route. ETA 8 minutes. Code Adam. Missing child." My least favorite call and simultaneously the one that demanded absolute priority. I grabbed my go bag, the one with emergency blankets, first aid supplies, water, and protein bars, and ran to my truck. The drive to Pinewood Campsite took 6 minutes instead of 8. I pulled into the gravel lot where 3 ranger vehicles already idled, lights flashing. Wilson stood by her truck, organizing a group of junior rangers into search teams. "Anderson," she nodded as I approached. "Lily Mason, 7 years old. Brown hair, green eyes, approximately 45 pounds. Last seen wearing pink pajama pants and a white t-shirt with a unicorn design. No shoes." "Parents?" I asked, scanning the growing crowd of concerned campers gathering at the edge of the site. "Over there." Wilson pointed toward a picnic table where a woman sat hunched over, her body racked with sobs. A tall man stood several feet away, talking to Ranger Mitchell. "Mother's Sarah, father's Robert. He reported it. Said the girl wandered off during breakfast while he was packing up their tent." I nodded and headed toward the parents, pausing at the search gear station to grab a handheld GPS unit. Something about the father's posture made me uncomfortable before I even reached him. He stood too straight, too composed for a man whose daughter was missing. Sarah Mason looked up as I approached. Her face was blotchy and swollen, mascara streaked down her cheeks in black rivers. Her hands clutched something to her chest, a small stuffed rabbit worn from years of love. "Mrs. Mason," I said, crouching to her eye level. "I'm Ranger Anderson. I'm going to help find Lily." She nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. She never goes off alone. She's careful. She knows the rules." Her fingers twisted in the rabbit's fur, knuckles white. This is her favorite, Bunny. She'd never leave him behind. Never. I made a mental note of this detail. Children rarely wandered far without their comfort objects. "Did Lily sleep well last night? Was she upset about anything?" I asked gently. Sarah shook her head. She was fine. Happy. We made s'mores. She was excited about hiking to the waterfall today. I turned toward Robert Mason, who had finished speaking with Mitchell and now stood watching our conversation from several feet away. His face betrayed no distress, not a hint of the panic you'd expect from a father whose child had been missing for nearly 2 hours. "Mr. Mason," I said, straightening up, "can you walk me through exactly what happened this morning?" He nodded once, his movements precise. "We woke around 7. Sarah started breakfast. I began packing up our gear. Lily was still in her pajamas, sitting at the picnic table coloring. I went to take down the tent. When I came back 10 minutes later, she was gone." His eyes fixed on mine with strange intensity, maintaining unbroken contact. There was something deeply unsettling about his stare, a hollowness behind it that sparked a memory. Eric. It was the same empty look. "Did you call for her?" I asked. "Of course." His response came immediately, without the hesitation of recollection. We searched the immediate area, then the restrooms. Sarah checked with neighboring campsites while I searched the trailhead. That's when I radioed for assistance. Everything he said sounded reasonable, textbook even, but something in his delivery felt rehearsed. I glanced at Sarah, still clutching the stuffed rabbit, then back at Robert. They seemed like they belonged to different emotional realities, her devastation against his eerie calm. And Lily has no history of wandering off? No incidents of hiding as a game? I pressed. No, Robert answered. The same second Sarah said, never. I nodded and stepped away to join Wilson, who was coordinating with the newly arrived K9 unit. Something's off with the father, I murmured to her, keeping my voice low. Wilson glanced over my shoulder. Yeah, I noticed. Too composed. It's not just that. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the connection I felt to the Eric incident without sounding paranoid. The way he stares reminds me of something. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't press for details. We've got 4 search teams ready to deploy. Standard grid pattern from the last known position. K9 has a scent item, a pillow from her sleeping bag. I studied the growing search operation. 24 rangers and volunteers were gathering, checking radio equipment and reviewing trail maps. The protocol for missing children was comprehensive, honed over decades of experience. In normal circumstances, I'd have complete confidence in our ability to find Lily before nightfall, but these didn't feel like normal circumstances. I'm going to talk to the father again, I told Wilson. Something doesn't add up. As I turned back toward the Masons' campsite, I caught Robert adjusting something beneath his jacket, a quick, subtle movement that sent another chill down my spine. He instantly dropped his hand when he noticed my attention. For the next hour, I interviewed adjacent campers while keeping Robert in my peripheral vision. No one had seen Lily that morning. 3 separate campers mentioned hearing an argument from the Mason site around dawn, though none could make out the words. By mid-afternoon, search teams had covered a 2-mile radius without result. Sarah's distress had intensified to the point where she struggled to breathe between sobs. I made a decision. Mrs. Mason, I said, approaching her again. We're bringing in additional resources for the search, including thermal imaging equipment. Protocol suggests we take you to the station where you'll be more comfortable and can speak with our support personnel. I can't leave, she gasped. What if she comes back? What if she's looking for me? Rangers will remain at the campsite, I assured her, and your husband can stay if he prefers. I caught Robert's eye as I said this. Something flickered across his face, the tiniest break in his mask of composure. That would be best, he said. I should stay here in case Lily returns. I nodded to 2 junior rangers. Please escort Mrs. Mason to the station. Make sure she gets water and something to eat. As they guided Sarah to a vehicle, I noticed Robert watching them leave with an odd intensity. His hand again moved toward whatever he kept concealed under his jacket. Darkness approached rapidly, the way it always does in the mountains. Search teams regrouped, switching to night operations. The K9 units had lost the scent at a stream half a mile east of the campsite. Thermal imaging would be our best hope now. I was checking battery packs for the night vision equipment when Robert appeared at my side, moving so quietly I hadn't heard his approach. Ranger Anderson, he said, his voice unnervingly steady. There's something I need to show you in the woods. I straightened slowly. What kind of something, Mr. Mason? I found tracks, earlier. I didn't mention them because I wasn't sure. His expression remained perfectly still as he spoke. But I think they might be Lily's. We have trained trackers on our team, I said carefully. If you point out the location, no. He cut me off with an intensity that made my neck hairs stand up. I need to show you specifically. It's not far. Every instinct warned me against following this man alone into the darkening forest. The weight of his stare, his unnatural calmness, the way he'd concealed something under his jacket, all of it screamed danger. But if there was even a remote chance he knew something about Lily's whereabouts, I couldn't dismiss it. Let me grab my pack, I said, stepping back toward my truck. I reached for my radio, pretending to check its battery while actually keying the mic. Dispatch, Anderson here, heading east of Pinewood Site 42 with Robert Mason to check possible tracks. We'll maintain radio contact. Copy that, Anderson. Check in every 15 minutes, came the response. I unsnapped my holster as I turned back to Robert, making the movement casual but deliberate. His eyes flickered down to my sidearm briefly, then back to my face. "Lead the way, Mr. Mason," I said. As he turned toward the tree line, I thought again of Eric's unblinking stare from 3 weeks ago. The same emptiness lurked behind Robert's eyes. Whatever connection existed between these two incidents, I was about to walk directly into it. I adjusted my flashlight and followed Robert into the woods, maintaining a careful distance between us. The darkness swallowed us step by step, the sounds of the search operation fading behind us. The woods consumed us as we moved further from the search operation. Tree branches swayed in the evening breeze, catching against my jacket. After 5 minutes of walking, I'd maintained regular distance checks to dispatch, but we were now approaching my next check-in time. Robert walked with unusual certainty through the deepening shadows, never hesitating at trail junctions or pausing to get his bearings. His movements had a fluid, almost predatory grace that contradicted what you'd expect from a distressed father. Each step took us farther from the comforting sounds of other rangers. "How much farther to these tracks?" I asked, my voice sounding tight even to my own ears. "Just ahead," Robert replied without turning around. "There's a small clearing where I found them." His unwavering confidence troubled me. Most civilians lost in these woods became disoriented quickly, especially under stress. Robert moved like someone who'd memorized the path. The narrow trail curved around a large boulder opening into a small clearing. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, painting silver patches on the forest floor. Robert stopped in the center and turned to face me. The shadows accentuated the hollowness of his eyes. "This is where you found the tracks?" I asked, scanning the ground with my flashlight. The soil showed no indentations, no sign of a child's bare feet. Robert's lips pulled into a tight smile. "My daughter isn't actually missing." My hand instinctively moved toward my holstered weapon. "What do you mean?" "She was never here." His voice remained flat, devoid of any parental emotion. "None of us were ever really here." Before I could process his words, Robert's hand emerged from his jacket, gripping a hunting knife with a blade that caught the moonlight. In one fluid motion too fast for normal human reflexes, he lunged forward. Pain erupted across my abdomen as the knife plunged in. The sensation was both burning and ice-cold, radiating outward from the point of impact. I stumbled backward, my brain struggling to catch up with what had just happened. "What?" I gasped, pressing my hand to the wound. Warm wetness spread beneath my fingers. Robert advanced without hesitation, his movements jerky yet precise, like a predator that had studied human movement but couldn't quite replicate it naturally. I tried to draw my weapon, but he struck again, the knife slashing across my arm. I crashed into a tree trunk, using it for momentary support. The forest spun around me as shock began setting in. Robert kept coming, his face expressionless despite the violence of his actions. "You Rangers always notice too much," he said, voice modulating strangely on certain syllables. "Always watching, recording, searching. The others wanted to wait, but I told them we needed to act now." He swung the knife again with impossible strength. I managed to dodge, but the movement sent fresh agony through my abdomen. Blood soaked my uniform shirt, disturbingly warm against my rapidly cooling skin. "Others?" I choked out, partly from pain and partly to keep him talking while I fumbled for my sidearm. "We've been here since before your kind named these woods," Robert continued, circling me with unnatural patience. "We learn, we watch, we become." My fingers finally closed around my Glock. With every ounce of remaining strength, I pulled it free and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing. Robert jerked as the bullet struck his chest, but his expression never changed. I fired again, and again. 3 shots total, center mass, exactly as training dictated. Robert stumbled backward, looking down at the spreading darkness on his chest with mild curiosity rather than pain. He collapsed to his knees, then onto his back. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the moonlight. But he was smiling. The smile stretched across his face, identical to the one I'd seen on Eric weeks earlier. too wide, too still, the lips pulled back to reveal perfect teeth. His eyes remained fixed on mine, unblinking even as blood bubbled from his mouth. "We've watched you, Mark Anderson," he whispered, his voice suddenly matching mine perfectly. "We know where the trails go. We know where the caves hide." My legs gave out. I slid down against the tree, one hand pressed to my stomach, the other fumbling for my radio. The world tilted and swayed around me, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. I keyed the mic with blood-slicked fingers. "Officer down, east of Pinewood 42. Attacked." The words came out slurred, my tongue feeling too large for my mouth. "Need immediate medical." Robert's body lay motionless across the clearing, but his eyes remained open, reflecting moonlight with an unnatural green tinge. The same unnatural green I'd seen in the cave. Time fragmented. I remember my radio crackling with urgent voices. I remember the distant sound of running footsteps and shouting. I remember trying to stay awake as cold spread through my limbs. My last conscious thought was of the stuffed rabbit clutched in Sarah Mason's hands, the beloved toy Lily would never leave behind. And I understood with terrible clarity that Robert had known exactly where his daughter was all along. I woke in a hospital room 3 days later, tubes snaking from my arms and beeping machines surrounding my bed. The surgeon later told me I'd lost 4 pints of blood and survived 4 stab wounds, 1 to the abdomen that missed my liver by centimeters, 2 to my left arm, and 1 to my upper chest that had collapsed my lung. "You're lucky to be alive," he said while checking my bandages. "If the rescue team hadn't reached you when they did." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I'd come within minutes of bleeding out in those woods. Chief Davis visited on my 5th day. His usually stern face softened with what might have been concern. He stood awkwardly at the foot of my bed, hat in his hands. "We found Sarah Mason," he said without preamble, "in their tent. She'd been dead for hours before Robert called in the missing child report, throat cut with the same knife he used on you." I nodded, unsurprised. "And Lily?" Davis shook his head. "No sign of her. We've had teams combing every inch of that forest for days. Dogs, thermal imaging, helicopters, nothing." "She was never there," I whispered, repeating Robert's words. Davis frowned. "What?" "That's what he told me before he attacked. My daughter isn't actually missing. She was never here." Davis rubbed a hand across his face. "None of this makes sense, Anderson. Robert Mason had no history of violence or mental illness. Their neighbors, friends, everyone described them as a normal, happy family. He had a job as an accountant. They owned a house in Seattle. Regular people." "Did you run DNA on him?" I asked. Davis gave me a strange look. "Of course. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual came up. No criminal record, no matches to any unsolved cases. I wanted to tell him about Eric, about the cave, about the impossible thing I'd seen moving in the darkness. But the words stuck in my throat. Even now, with 4 stab wounds as evidence, I knew how it would sound. "Get some rest," Davis said, placing his hat back on his head. "We'll talk more when you're recovered." After he left, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles. The doctors had warned me that trauma often caused vivid dreams, sometimes indistinguishable from memories. But I knew what I'd seen in Robert's eyes as he lay dying in that clearing. The same empty nothingness I'd seen in Eric's unblinking stare. The same intelligence that had watched me from the darkness of Ridgeline Cave. Whatever these things were, they were learning to look like us, talk like us, move among us. And for some reason, I couldn't yet understand. They had noticed me noticing them. I pressed the button for more pain medication, welcoming the cloudy oblivion it brought. In my dreams, I heard Robert's voice, my voice, whispering, "We've been here since before your kind named these woods." And I knew with bone-deep certainty that returning to Blackwood Park meant walking back into their territory, where more hollow-eyed figures waited, watching and learning how to wear our faces. "You need to eat something," my sister Elaine said, placing a plate of toast beside the stack of newspapers I'd been sorting all morning. "It's past noon." I nodded without looking up, my fingers still tracing the headline from a 1952 edition of the Blackwood County Chronicle, "Fourth Child Missing as Search Continues." The article sat in a growing pile of similar stories I'd arranged chronologically on her dining room table. "Mark," her voice sharpened, "the doctor said you need to maintain your strength." "I know." I reluctantly grabbed a piece of toast and took a bite, the butter congealing on the now cold bread. My side ached as I shifted in the chair, a constant reminder of the 4 stab wounds that had nearly ended me 6 weeks ago. Physically, I was healing. The doctors had called my recovery remarkable. Mentally was another story. I hadn't slept through the night since waking up in that hospital bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert Mason's face, that unnaturally wide smile as he lay dying, blood pooling beneath him, whispering my words back to me in my own voice. Elaine's Portland townhouse had become my temporary sanctuary. Her spare bedroom was covered with maps of Blackwood Park I'd ordered online, along with printouts of historical weather patterns, animal migration records, and every missing persons report I could legally obtain. My sister had stopped commenting on my wall of crazy 3 weeks ago, instead focusing on practical matters like medication schedules and physical therapy appointments. "The library called," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "They found those microfiche records you requested." "Thanks." I circled another date on my timeline, 1937, when 3 hikers vanished near the North Ridge, the same area where Ridgeline Cave would later be discovered and subsequently restricted. "You know," Elaine said carefully, "Dr. Westfield mentioned that fixating on—" "I'm not fixating," I cut her off. "I'm investigating." That wasn't entirely true. I'd become obsessed with mapping every disappearance, every unusual animal attack, every unexplained incident at Blackwood Park, going back as far as records existed. Public libraries in 3 counties had become accustomed to my requests for obscure local newspapers. I'd even paid a graduate student at Portland State to access archived journals from early settlers. What I'd found confirmed my worst suspicions. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Every 7 years, like clockwork, reports of missing hikers spiked. Animals behaved erratically, and children disappeared most frequently within 2 miles of caves or underground formations. Davis and the park administration had missed it because they weren't looking at the whole picture. Each incident was filed away separately, explained as bear attacks or careless hikers or unfortunate accidents. But when you laid them all out chronologically, as I had across Elaine's dining room, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I picked up a photocopied page from an 1887 trapper's journal. The Jenkins boy returned after 3 days missing. His mother weeps with joy, but something troubles me about the child. He speaks oddly and watches us when he thinks we don't notice. The dog growls whenever he approaches. Another clipping from 1916. Search party discovers abandoned camp near limestone caverns. Personal effects present but no sign of the Thompson family. Ranger Wilcox reports unusual tracks resembling bear prints, but with hand-like features. My hands trembled slightly as I sorted them into the timeline. The painkillers were wearing off, but I didn't reach for the bottle. I needed clarity more than comfort. The following evening, I drove to the county library and spent hours combing through microfiche records of the Blackwood Gazette from 1951-1959. 4 hours of scrolling brought me to what I was looking for, a front-page story from June 1958 about 5 children who vanished during a Boy Scout camping trip. The article included a photograph of the search party and, in smaller print below, an image of the recovered items. 5 small backpacks nearly identical to the one we'd found after Eric disappeared. My phone buzzed with a text from Chief Davis. Medical clearance came through. Limited desk duty available starting Monday if you're ready. I stared at the message for a long moment. Going back meant facing whatever waited in those woods. but it also meant access to files I couldn't get as a civilian. "I'll be there," I texted back. The ranger station felt simultaneously familiar and foreign when I returned 3 days later. Colleagues greeted me with awkward smiles and concerned glances. Some avoided eye contact entirely. The news of my attack and Robert Mason's death had spread throughout the service, growing more distorted with each retelling. "Good to have you back, Anderson," Davis said, showing me to a desk in the administration area. "Nothing strenuous. Just help Wilson digitize the old incident reports. Doctor says 4 hours max per day." "Understood," I said, noticing how he carefully avoided mentioning Mason or the attack. "And Anderson," he added, lowering his voice. "Let's keep the focus on moving forward, all right? Some things are better left in the past." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Davis patted my shoulder and walked away, missing the bitter smile that crossed my face. Everything I needed lay in the past. For 2 weeks, I played the role of the dutiful, recovering ranger. I digitized reports, helped with visitor information, and maintained a careful facade of normalcy. I laughed at the right moments during lunch breaks and deflected questions about my recovery with vague assurances. Meanwhile, I exploited every minute alone to access files normally restricted to senior staff. My ranger credentials still opened most digital locks, and knowing the filing system gave me advantages civilian researchers lacked. What I found confirmed my theories. A 1962 ranger reported encountering a childlike figure standing motionless in a remote section of the woods. The child disappeared when the ranger looked away momentarily. The incident was filed under visitor misconduct prank. In 1976, 2 rangers documented unusual tracks near the North Caves. 5-toed prints too large for a mountain lion but showing clear articulation unlike a bear. The file included a plaster cast that had been broken and poorly reassembled. Classification: unidentified wildlife. Most damning was a thin file from 1991 where Ranger Bernard Taylor described a confrontation with a hiker who moved wrong and spoke with mechanical precision, mimicking Taylor's own phrases. The encounter ended with Taylor firing his weapon when the hiker attacked him with inhuman strength. The body was never recovered. Taylor requested transfer the following week. Classification: violent visitor incident, possible drug influence. None of these reports mentioned connections to previous incidents. Each was treated as isolated, unexplained, and ultimately dismissed. On my 3rd week back, I discovered what I'd been looking for: the official report on Ridgeline Cave following my attack. A single-page document authorized by Regional Director Hammond ordered the cave permanently sealed due to structural instability posing imminent danger to park visitors. Attached was an environmental impact assessment that seemed suspiciously brief, and a work order for industrial-grade concrete barriers installed 2 days after I'd been airlifted to the hospital. They hadn't just restricted the cave, they'd entombed it. The question was whether they'd sealed something in, or merely covered up evidence. That same afternoon, I found a file labeled Forensic Analysis, Incident 422B. Inside was the DNA report on Eric's backpack. The results showed partial DNA matches to 5 different missing children from the 1958 Boy Scout disappearance. Not similar DNA, the exact same markers present across multiple distinct samples, as if the children had somehow merged or been combined. The analyst's notes indicated the findings were inconsistent with natural genetic patterns and recommended more sensitive testing. At the bottom, scrawled in Davis's unmistakable handwriting, "No further testing authorized. File as inconclusive." I photographed the document with my phone before carefully returning it to the exact position I'd found it. At home that night, I added these new findings to my growing map of connections. The picture taking shape was more disturbing than even my nightmares had suggested. These entities, whatever they were, had been in Blackwood for generations, watching, learning, and imitating with increasing sophistication. Eric had been an early attempt, good enough to fool distant observation, but failing at close interaction. Robert Mason represented something far more advanced, capable of maintaining a complete human identity for extended periods, even fooling those closest to him. I wondered how many others were out there, wearing faces that weren't their own. "You need to make a decision about your future with the Park Service," Dr. Freeman said during our weekly session. She was the third therapist I'd been assigned since the attack. The previous two had recommended extended leave after hearing my theories. I studied her office, noting the carefully arranged plants and tastefully framed degrees. She'd been brought in specifically to evaluate rangers after traumatic incidents. I'd learned to censor my thoughts around her. "I've been considering my options," I said. "Chief Davis mentioned you haven't responded to the field duty clearance forms. Your physical recovery is proceeding well. Is there something specific holding you back from returning to regular duties?" I considered my answer carefully. "I've developed an interest in the historical aspects of park management." She made a note. "Historical aspects? Records, archives, documented incidents. I believe understanding patterns from the past can improve current protocols." "That's quite a change from your previous focus on active rangering," she observed. "Does this interest relate to your experience with Robert Mason?" "Yes," I admitted. "I've found documentation of similar incidents throughout the park's history, patterns that might have helped predict what happened." Her pen paused above her notepad. "Similar in what way?" I needed to tread carefully. "Violent encounters with visitors showing unusual behavior, unexplained disappearances clustered in specific areas. If these patterns had been recognized earlier, maybe I could have been better prepared for Mason." This was the sanitized version, close enough to my actual thoughts to sound sincere, but stripped of anything that would trigger psychiatric red flags. "So you're interested in an analytical role rather than returning to fieldwork?" she asked. "I'd like to request permanent assignment to Blackwood's Archives and Historical Documentation Division," I said. "There's a position opening next month when Ranger Michaels retires." "That's quite a career change, Mark. Are you sure it's what you want?" I met her eyes. "Something's been here long before us," I said, allowing myself one moment of complete honesty. "And I intend to understand what it wants." Her expression flickered with concern before returning to professional neutrality. "What do you mean by something?" "Patterns," I said, retreating to safer territory. "Historical patterns of human behavior and wildlife interaction that we haven't properly documented or analyzed." She nodded slowly, writing something I couldn't see. "And understanding these patterns is important to you?" "It's everything," I said simply. 3 days later, Davis called me into his office. My transfer request form sat on his desk alongside Dr. Freeman's evaluation. "Archives Division," he said, tapping the paper. "You're sure about this? You were on track for Senior Ranger before the incident." "I'm sure." He studied me for a long moment. "Freeman says you've been researching historical incidents at Blackwood." "Part of my recovery process," I said, trying to make sense of what happened. "And has it helped?" "It's given me perspective." Davis leaned back in his chair. "You know, Anderson, some things in these woods defy easy explanation. Been that way since long before the Park Service came along." I watched him carefully, wondering how much he actually knew. "My grandmother grew up near here," he continued. "Used to tell stories about the woods being watchful. Said some places weren't meant for people to stay too long." He shrugged. "Old superstitions." "But you sealed Ridgeline Cave," I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Structural concerns. The geological survey was clear." "Right." A heavy silence filled the office. Davis finally sighed and signed the transfer request. "Archives Division it is. Michaels will train you before he leaves." He handed me the signed form. "Just remember something, Anderson. Archives are for preserving the past, not for getting lost in it." "Understood, sir." As I turned to leave, he added, "And Anderson, some files are restricted for good reason. Some questions don't have answers we're meant to understand. I nodded and closed the door behind me. Back at my temporary desk, I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote down everything from our conversation. Davis knew more than he let on, perhaps not the full truth, but enough to be afraid of it. And he wasn't alone. The pattern of concealment stretched back through decades of park management. I thought about the librarian who'd shown me those settler journals, her voice dropping to a whisper as she'd said, "My grandfather used to say these woods have eyes, and they're learning all the time." My phone buzzed with a text from Elaine. "Movers confirmed for next week. Sure about taking that ranger cabin?" I typed back, "Yes. Need to be close to the archives. Close to the woods. Close to whatever had been watching us, learning from us, becoming us. I'd given up the idea of escaping it. Now I only wanted to understand. The cabin they'd assigned me was small but serviceable, located on the eastern edge of the park near the administration buildings, far from Ridgeline Point and Pinewood Campground, but close enough to the archives where I'd spend my days digging through decades of reports, mapping incidents, and looking for the patterns everyone else had missed or deliberately ignored. I wouldn't go back into the deep woods. I didn't need to. The answers I sought were hidden in plain sight, scattered throughout Blackwood's history like breadcrumbs. 3 nights before my official transfer to the Archives Division, I woke at 2 a.m. to find my notebook open on the bedside table, though I distinctly remembered putting it in my desk drawer. A single sentence had been written in what looked like my handwriting. "We've been watching you watch us." I stared at it for a long time, the implication clear. They weren't just in the woods anymore. They had followed me to Portland, to my sister's house, to this room. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm certainty. Whatever game we were playing, I was no longer just their observer. I had become something they watched in return. So be it. Let them watch me hunt for answers. Let them wonder what I knew or thought I knew. The archives contained over a century of documentation. If these entities had been here that long, they had left traces even they might not recognize. I had one advantage they couldn't imitate: human intuition. The ability to see connections between seemingly unrelated events, to reconstruct a story from fragments, to understand motivation and intent. I closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in the drawer. Tomorrow I would begin my new assignment, combing through dusty files and forgotten reports, looking for the patterns, building the timeline, understanding what had always been in these woods, watching and learning, and maybe, just maybe, figuring out what it wanted.